Tonight, as you settle into your blankets and let the day grow soft around you, I want to take you back with me. Back through the years and back through the snow, to a winter I have never been able to forget, and yet somehow have made my peace with. I was 12 years old that winter, just a boy, though at the time I felt much older. Now, as I sit here by my fire in California, 82 years behind me and the mountains a distant blue line on the horizon, I can still feel that cold if I close my eyes. I can still see the drifts piled higher than our wagon wheels, still hear the wind moving through the tall pines around Donner Lake, humming low like someone talking in another room. It was the winter of 1846 into 47. In those days, people spoke of California as a promise, a word that tasted of sunshine and oranges and fields that never froze. There were 87 of us when our wagons first turned west from Illinois, all full of the same bright idea, that we could cross a continent and start our lives over on the far side of the Sierra Nevada. What I needed most that winter, though I did not know how to name it then, was not just food or fire or shelter. Those were important, of course. But beneath all of that, what I needed most was to hold on to my family and to the part of myself that knew right from wrong, even when the snow cut us off from the world and hunger began to whisper its own desperate logic. Even now, I can feel the worn handle of our family cooking pot in my hands. It had rattled all the way from our kitchen in Illinois, swinging on the side of the wagon, blackened by 100 suppers. That little pot became the center of our world, of our evenings, of our hopes, and of the quiet, terrible choices we faced when the food inside it began to run thin. If you are new here tonight, know that you are safe. You do not need to remember every detail. You do not need to stay awake to hear the ending. My story will keep on quietly, whether your eyes are open or closed. And if you have wandered this way before, I am glad to have your company again. Let your shoulders soften. Let your jaw loosen. Feel the weight of the day slipping away like dust shaken from a wagon wheel. Tonight, if you are willing, I would like to tell you how we survived. How a boy of 12 lived through that Sierra Nevada winter, what it cost, and what it gave back in the end. Let me take you back to where it all began, to a dewy Illinois morning, and the day we rolled our wagon out of the yard for the very last time. I was 12 years old that spring of 1846, and until then the whole of my world had been a small farm in Illinois. I can still see that farmhouse when I close my eyes. It was not much to look at, low and square, with clapboard walls weathered to a soft gray, and a roof that creaked and sighed whenever the wind came in from the west. Behind it, our cornfields stretched out in straight green lines, and beyond those, more fields, and then a fringe of distant trees that might as well have been the edge of the earth for all I had ever seen past them. Mornings began the same way as long as I can remember. The rooster would crow while the sky was still barely light, and somewhere in the house my mother would stir. If I think hard enough, I can almost hear the soft thump of her bare feet on the floorboards, the hiss of the stove as she coaxed the fire back to life, the gentle rattle of the coffee pot on the iron. On those mornings, the house smelled of coffee and frying salt pork, and the sweet, clean scent of fresh cut hay drifting in when someone opened the back door. I remember the way the chill of the spring air would rush in and wrap itself around my ankles before the warmth of the stove claimed the room again. My mother was a practical woman, but gentle with it. She kept a quilt folded at the foot of each bed, the pattern stitched from scraps of dresses and shirts that had outlived their first use. She carried in her head a store of recipes from back east, as she called it, where her people had come from before Illinois was even a state. In my memory, she is always moving, stirring something, mending something, tucking hair back from one of our foreheads with a touch that seemed to hold the whole world steady. My father was quieter, but his quiet had weight to it. He was a farmer by trade and by nature, with hands that were roughened by years of turning soil and lifting stones, but which could cradle a newborn lamb as gently as any midwife. When he talked about California, his eyes would go far away, as if he were already there, feeling that gentler sun on his shoulders. Land that doesn't freeze solid 6 months of the year, he would say, half to himself. Trees that stay green, oranges, if you can believe it, growing right out in the open. He did not have many books, my father, but he had a good memory, and he had listened well to every trader and traveler who had passed along the road. In his mind, California had become a place where hard work was still needed, but where the land might meet a man halfway instead of fighting him for every seed. I had an older sister, 3 years ahead of me. To me, she was ancient and wise at 15, though of course she was still mostly a girl. She had a red wool scarf that our mother had knitted one winter, and she wore it whenever the wind even thought of blowing. That scarf became part of how I pictured her, even later in the mountains, a slash of color in a world that was all white and brown and gray. I also had a younger sibling. We will call her Annie, though perhaps that was not her exact name. She was 6 that year, with hair that would not lie flat and a laugh that came out in quick, bright bursts like bird song. She was small enough still to climb into my lap by the fire and fall asleep with her head on my shoulder, and big enough to be very proud when she managed to help Mother carry in a small armful of kindling. Back then, my concerns were simple: chores, a bit of schooling when the season allowed, the way the creek looked when it thawed in the spring, and whether I could skip a stone all the way across. I knew the smell of fresh turned earth and the sound of wagon wheels in the dirt lane, and the feel of the kitchen hearth's heat on my hands when I came in from feeding the hens on a frosted morning. You have to understand, things were different then. We did not have trains and paved roads and telegraphs, not the way they do now. Word from the outside world came by newspaper, if it came at all, or from the mouths of strangers passing through. When people spoke of the West, of Oregon and California, they did so as one might speak of another planet, distant, glittering, full of stories. "It is the year 1846, my father said once, as if tasting the numbers. "And men say that if a body wants land and is willing to work for it, there is no better time to be alive." I did not know if that was true. I only knew that when he said the word California, something in his voice changed. It grew soft at the edges, like a man talking in his sleep. It was Mother who first set our cooking pot into the wagon. We did not have many fine things, but that pot was one of the few objects I would have called ours without thinking. It was small, as such things go, but sturdy, blackened by years of use, its iron sides worn smooth where many hands had scrubbed them. My mother had used it to make stews on long winter nights, and to boil water for washing when we had no other clean containers. In my memory, there was almost always something in it, beans, or scraps of salt pork or cornmeal porridge for breakfast. On the morning she lifted it up and settled it into a wooden crate in the wagon. I remember feeling a strange flutter in my chest, as if the house itself were packing a piece of its heart to send along with us. My father came around the side of the wagon just then, wiping his hands on a rag, and he saw the pot sitting there among the wrapped dishes and folded linens. He reached down and ran his thumb along its handle, the way a man might touch an old friend's shoulder. "As long as we can put something in that pot," he said quietly, mostly to Mother but loud enough that I heard, "we'll be all right." At the time, it sounded like simple good sense. Now, looking back, I hear more in those words than he perhaps meant at the moment. They became, for me, a kind of measure, not only of how much food we had left, but of how much hope. We set out from Illinois that spring, following what people had begun to call the great tide of wagons heading west. Folks spoke of the Oregon Trail and the California Trail as if they were proper roads, marked and measured, waiting only for wheels to roll over them. In truth, they were little more than paths through grass and dust and dreams, worn by the passage of those who had gone before and the longing of those who followed after. I did not know then how long those miles could feel. I remember the morning. We left more clearly than almost any morning since. The air had that bright, clear feeling spring mornings get, when the frost has gone but the world has not yet grown warm. Dew clung to every blade of grass, catching the first slanting light of the sun so that the whole yard seemed to sparkle. Our breath still made faint clouds in front of our faces, but there was a promise of warmth in the way the light fell on the eastern side of the house. The wagon stood in the lane, its canvas stretched tight over ribs of bent wood, looking at once proud and slightly uncertain, like a horse facing a new jump. The oxen were already in their yokes, big, patient creatures with eyes that seemed to understand more than you might think. Their breath steamed in the cool air, and now and then one would switch its tail, flicking away an invisible annoyance. Neighbors had come to see us off. That was the custom then. People did not keep grand farewells for journeys like ours. They simply turned up in their everyday clothes, with a handshake and a pie wrapped in a cloth, and words that did not always rise to what they wanted to say. Mrs. Carter from the next farm over stood by the gate, her hands folded in her apron, tears starting and stopping in her eyes like a hesitant rain. She had brought us a jar of preserves for the road, though it would likely not last far beyond the first week. "You write if you can," she told my mother. "And if you can't, you think of us, we'll be thinking of you." My mother smiled, though her own eyes were not quite dry. "We'll send word from California," she said, as if the distances in between were nothing at all. My father moved steadily through the last of the preparations, checking the way the crates were tied, making sure the barrel of water was well secured. He climbed up to the driver's seat, then down again, then up once more, as if he needed to feel the height of that perch under him before we set out in earnest. My sister stood near the wagon's wheel, her red wool scarf wrapped twice around her neck against the morning chill. She tugged at one end of it absently, a nervous habit, and when she caught me looking, she made a face that was half smile, half grimace. "Are you scared?" she asked, her voice pitched low so the grown-ups would not hear. "A little," I admitted. "Me too," she said. After a moment, she nudged my shoulder with hers. "But we'll be scared together, all right." "All right." Little Annie ran circles around us, too excited to be still. She would careen toward the fence, then stop to pat a chicken that had strayed too near, then race back to the wagon to peer inside at the crates piled there, as if one of them might open itself and sprout California right there in the yard. Inside the house, everything seemed emptier than I had ever known it. The beds were stripped, the trunks carried out, the tables bare. My mother and I went back in one last time to make sure nothing had been forgotten. The kitchen smelled different without the usual clutter of cooking. No coffee, no frying meat, just the faint tang of ashes in the hearth and the sight of our old pot's soot-stained ring on the hook where it had hung. "Will someone else live here?" I asked, running my hand over the scarred kitchen table. "Maybe," Mother said, "or maybe it will settle into the earth again. Houses have their own journeys." She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the small, familiar rooms. I watched her take it all in, the bed where Annie had been born, the window where she had sat to mend shirts in the late afternoon light, the corner where the Bible always rested. "Remember," she said at last, turning back to me, "whatever happens, we stay together." I nodded, though I did not fully understand yet what "whatever happens" might mean. Outside, my father had taken his place on the wagon seat. The neighbors had begun to step back from the lane, making room for the team to move. There was a moment, just a breath, when everything seemed to hold still. Then father clucked gently to the oxen. The great shoulders leaned into their yokes, and the wagon gave a slow lurch forward. We started rolling just as the sun cleared the tops of the bare trees at the edge of our property. The wheels creaked, the harness chains rattled softly, and the first small cloud of dust rose from the lane behind us. I walked alongside at first, my hand resting against the sideboard, feeling every jolt of the road in the wood under my palm. The cooking pot, hung from a hook on the wagon's side, swung with the motion, clanking softly in a rhythm that soon became as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. As we reached the end of the lane and turned onto the road, I looked back over my shoulder. The farmhouse stood in the early light, smaller than it had ever looked to me before. The dew on the roof shingles caught the sun and made them shine. Smoke from Mrs. Carter's chimney drifted up, the only sign that life would go on there without us. Looking back now, I realized that was the last time I would see that roofline through morning mist. At 12, I did not think in such terms. I only knew that something behind us was closing, even as something ahead of us opened. We rolled on, the house growing smaller with each step, until at last it was hidden by a gentle rise in the land. I felt something catch in my chest then, a small, sharp feeling, as if a thread had been stretched too far between me and that place. Beside me, my sister adjusted her scarf once more and matched her stride to mine. Little Annie, grown tired at last, had been lifted into the wagon to sit beside Mother. California's only a matter of miles and months, boy, Father called down at one point, as if he had heard my unspoken doubts. Just keep putting one foot in front of the other. I did not answer aloud, but in my heart I tried to believe him. At 12, I thought miles were like days. You could count them, and when you reached the end, you were done. I did not yet know how very long miles could feel. The first days on the road were only a longer version of every journey to town I had ever known. Fences slipped by on either side, then open fields, then groves of trees where the shade striped the road. We camped in pastures or by little creeks, never too far from some farmhouse or other. It almost felt in those early miles as if we were simply circling a larger yard. But then the houses thinned out. The fields gave way to wider stretches of grassland where cows grazed without fences, and the sky grew larger with every day's travel. We were headed to meet the main train near a place called Independence, though I did not know the name at the time. To me, it was simply the town where all the wagons gather. I remember the first glimpse of it. After days of seeing only our own single wagon, perhaps one or two others in the distance, We topped a small rise, and there, below us, lay a broad, flat stretch of land along a river, filled with white-topped wagons. They were everywhere, dozens, then scores, their canvas covers shining in the sunlight, their wheels making faint, dusty halos around them. Oxen and mules grazed in clusters. Smoke from many small fires rose into the air and hung there like a thin veil. I could hear the sound of hammers on metal from a blacksmith's shed, the lowing of cattle, and the rumble of many voices. I later learned that place was called Independence. I would tell people years after. The big jumping off for the West. At 12, I only knew that I had never seen so many people in one place outside of a fair. It made our own little farm wagon feel suddenly very small. We rolled down into that sea of white canvases and dust, and somehow, without my quite understanding how, we became part of the whole. A man with a red band around his hat came over to us, asked my father a few questions in a tone that said he had asked them many times before, and then pointed to a place where we might pull in and make camp among a cluster of other families. There were names spoken that stayed with me: Donner, Reed, Graves, Breen. Some belonged to people who would share our winter, some to those who would part ways before the mountains. At the time, they were only sounds that the grown-ups exchanged with handshakes and nods. One man in particular stood out to me. He was not the loudest, nor the tallest, but there was something in the way the others glanced at him that told me he was used to being listened to. He had a weather-creased face, the skin around his eyes browned and lined by years of squinting into sun and wind, and his hands were strong and steady on the reins of his own team. When he looked out across the land, it was with the calm of someone for whom this country was not entirely new. There was a man with a face like old leather, I would say sometimes in later years, who seemed to know the prairie like other men knew their own barns. He was a trail captain of some sort. I do not think I ever heard his name clearly, but his presence meant something. When he spoke to the gathered men about how the wagons should travel, how far we might go each day, and how we ought to circle each night, his voice had the weight of experience. "Stay with the wagons," he said that first evening as people clustered around to listen. "Follow orders, trust your teams. The land is big, but we are bigger together." That night, camped among so many others, everything felt different than it had on the road from home. The circle of wagons made a kind of temporary town. Fires dotted the open space in the center, each one its own small world where a family's life was unfolding. Our little cooking pot hung on its hook, now swung among many others on many different fires. That first night on the prairie, Mother used it to make a simple stew from beans and a scrap of pork, and for the first time in my life, she invited other people to share from its contents. Neighbors came with their own contributions. a handful of coffee grounds, a pinch of salt, a spoonful of dried vegetables. It all went into the pot, and what came out was something far better than the sum of its parts. I remember sitting there by the fire, the night wind cool on my back, the warmth of the flames on my face, and watching the way the firelight caught the curve of the pot, the black iron gleaming in places where the soot had worn thin. Our little pot sat in the center of the fire, I think, and for the first time its contents were shared beyond just our family. It felt like a tiny, iron-handled hearth we had carried out into the world. Beside me, a boy a little older than I was introduced himself. He was from another wagon, another state, Iowa, I think, and his family was also bound for the promised lands of the West. His name has slipped away from me now after all these years, but I remember the sound of his laugh and the way he talked about the plains ahead as if they were a grand adventure that we had already begun. "Imagine it," he said, gesturing broadly. "Buffalo herds, they say, so big they take days to pass. Mountains so high your ears pop. Real Indians with feathers and everything." I half believed him, half thought he was making up stories to impress me. But either way, the pictures he painted in my mind made the road seem less like a line of dust and more like a tale unfolding. As the fire burned low and the stars came out, more stars than I had ever seen from our little farmhouse yard, my father nudged me gently. "You keep an eye on that pot," he said in a low voice, nodding toward where it rested on the stones at the fire's edge. "As long as we don't lose that, we haven't lost home." I nodded, feeling a small, solemn responsibility settle over me. It seemed a simple task then. A boy could watch a pot, surely. I did not know yet how often that little piece of iron would become the measure of our days. The days that followed settled into a kind of rhythm. The wagons rolled out not long after dawn, when the oxen had grazed and the fires had burned down to ash. Dust rose in soft clouds around the wheels and hung in the still morning air. We stopped at midday to rest the teams and eat, then moved on again until the sun tilted low and the trail captain called a halt. Nights in the wagon were different from nights at home. The sound of the wind across the prairie had a particular voice, broad and steady, as if the land itself were breathing. Coyotes yipped and called to one another out in the dark, but their cries seemed distant, unreal, like something from a long-ago story. I would lie on my pallet by the wagon's side, listening to the soft creaks of the wood as it cooled from the day's heat, to the murmur of my parents, voices when they thought we children were asleep, to the occasional laugh drifting in from another campfire. Sometimes my sister would whisper across the narrow space between us. "Do you think we'll really see the ocean?" she would ask. "I guess so," I'd say, though I had only the vaguest idea of what an ocean might properly look like. Do you think it will be blue? Yes, I'd tell her because it felt right, bluer than anything. She would be quiet after that, and in the stillness I would listen to the canvas above our heads gently lifting and settling with each breath of wind. There were other sounds too. The grown men's voices, when they thought we children were far enough away not to hear, could carry a different tone. Around the campfire one evening, as I lingered at the edge of the circle pretending to be more interested in the stars, I heard a word spoken more than once in that low, heavy way grown-ups have when something troubles them. "A shortcut," someone muttered. "Hastings Cutoff," another replied. "He says it'll save us weeks." "Or cost us more," came a third voice. "I've heard those Wasatch Mountains are no path for wagons." I did not understand most of what they said. I only knew that when the word short cut was spoken, it did not sound like the clever, helpful idea the word usually meant. It sounded weighted, uncertain, like a coin spun in the air that no one had yet seen land. I had heard the word shortcut more than once, I would say later, though the way the men said it made it sound heavier than it should. Still, for a boy of 12, each new dawn brought more immediate concerns. How far would we go that day? Would there be a river to cross? Would I be allowed to ride on the wagon tongue for a while, feeling the sway of the boards under my feet and pretending I was a ship's captain on some inland sea of grass? I did not know then what lay ahead. None of us did. By the time we left the safety of the last real town behind, the last place with proper buildings and a general store, and a sign swinging from chains above a door, the world had grown wide and wild around us. The line between civilization and wilderness had blurred into an expanse of open land that seemed to have no end. Our little pot swung faithfully at the wagon's side, clanking softly with each rut and stone, like a bell marking each mile. The days were still long and golden then, the nights cool but not yet cold. California was a word we could speak without a shiver. What happened next is something I have thought about many times since. But that, dear friend, belongs to the next part of our journey, the long, slow turning of grassland into desert, and desert into mountains, and mountains into snow. For now, you may let these early miles settle in your mind like dust in a sunbeam. The farm is behind us. The wagons are gathered. The road lies ahead, bright and full of promise. The first days beyond independence blurred together in my memory like the colors of a prairie sunset, long, golden, and edged with shadow. I cannot tell you exactly how many miles we covered each day. The grown-ups spoke of 15, sometimes 20, but to a boy of 12 those numbers meant little. What I remember instead is the rhythm, the creak of wagon wheels, the soft thud of oxen hooves on packed earth, The way the dust rose behind us in a pale cloud that seemed to follow our little train like a loyal dog. The land itself was like nothing I had ever seen. Back in Illinois, there were always fences, always the edge of someone's field to mark where one thing ended and another began. Out here, the grass went on, rippling in the wind like water. Some days it was green, other days it had a golden tinge, as if the sun had soaked into it overnight. And always the sky, so big it made me feel both very small and strangely free. I walked alongside the wagon most of the time. The oxen moved slowly, and it was easy to keep pace. Sometimes my sister walked with me, her red scarf bright against the brown and green of the landscape. We did not always talk. There were hours when the only sound was the wind and the distant call of birds I did not recognize. But when we did talk, it was about small things. The shape of a cloud, whether the river ahead would be easy to cross, what California might smell like. I heard there are flowers that bloom all year, she said once, squinting at the horizon as if she might see them already. Maybe, I said. Father says the soil is dark and rich, good for growing things. She nodded, adjusting her scarf against a gust of wind. I hope there are trees. I miss trees. I looked around at the endless grass and understood what she meant. The openness was beautiful, but it was also relentless. There was nowhere to hide from the sun, nowhere to sit in cool shade and watch the leaves move overhead. At night, we circled the wagons and built our fires in the center. The flames seemed small against the vastness of the dark, but they were enough. People gathered close, sharing food and stories, their faces lit by the flickering light. Our little cooking pot found its place among the others. Mother would hang it over the fire, and soon the smell of whatever we had managed to put together would rise into the night air. Sometimes it was beans, sometimes a thin stew made from dried meat, and whatever vegetables had not yet spoiled. It was never fancy, but it was warm, and it was ours. I learned in those early weeks that the pot was more than just a tool. It was a gathering place. People would drift over to our fire, drawn by the smell or simply by the light, and before long there would be a small crowd. Neighbors from other wagons, children looking for playmates, grown-ups exchanging news and worries. "Your mother's got away with that pot," one of the men said once, nodding toward where she stood stirring. "Makes even beans taste like Sunday dinner." Father smiled at that, a rare thing in those days. "She's got away with most things," he said. "It's why I married her." I did not fully understand what he meant then, but I remembered it later in the mountains, when the pot held less and less, and my mother's hands still moved with the same steady grace, coaxing warmth from almost nothing. What I remember most about those early miles is the feeling of possibility. The road stretched ahead of us, and though we did not know where it would lead, We believed it would lead somewhere good. I did not know then how that belief would be tested. None of us did. I later learned that bend in the river was just another nameless camp along the Platte, one of dozens we would pass before the summer was out. But to me, at 12 years old, it was the first place the world seemed bigger than our wagon train. When I first saw it, I thought the river went on forever. It shone in the afternoon light like a piece of the sky laid down on the ground, wide and slow-moving, its banks lined with cottonwood trees whose leaves flickered silver and green in the breeze. After so many days of open grass, those trees seemed like old friends waiting to welcome us. We made camp in a broad meadow near the water. The oxen were unhitched and led to drink, their big heads dipping low, their sides heaving with relief. Children scattered along the bank, some wading in up to their knees, others searching for smooth stones to skip across the surface. I wanted to join them, but my mother called me back to help with the fire. There was wood to gather, real wood, not the dried buffalo chips we had sometimes had to use on the open plains, and water to carry, and the pot to clean before supper. It was while I was scrubbing the pot at the river's edge that I met her. She was an older woman, perhaps my grandmother's age, with gray hair pulled back under a faded bonnet and hands that looked as if they had done every kind of work there was. She had come down to the water with a bundle of herbs wrapped in cloth, and she knelt nearby to rinse them in the current. "That's a good pot," she said, nodding toward the iron in my hands. "Looks like it's seen some miles." "Yes, ma'am," I said. "It came all the way from Illinois." She smiled at that, a gentle smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Most of us came from somewhere else. The trick is remembering to bring the right things with you." I did not know what to say to that, so I just kept scrubbing. But she did not seem to mind the silence. She finished rinsing her herbs and tucked them back into the cloth, then paused and looked at me more closely. "You're one of the young ones," she said, "traveling with your family." "Yes, ma'am. My mother and father, my sister, and my little sister Annie." "Good," she said. "Good to have family. Out here, we all borrow each other's strength. Don't be shy to ask when you need help." Before I could respond, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out something small and metal. It was a tin cup, dented in places but still whole, with a handle that curved just right for small fingers. "Here," she said, pressing it into my hand. "Now you've got your own place at any pot you find. No waiting for others at mealtime." I stared at the cup, not quite believing it was mine. "Thank you," I managed. "Thank you, ma'am." She waved a hand as if it were nothing. "Just pass it on someday when you meet someone who needs a little kindness." I carried that cup back to our wagon and showed it to my mother, who smiled and said I should keep it in my pocket where it would not get lost. I did, and for the rest of the journey it stayed there, a small weight against my leg that reminded me, whenever I touched it, that strangers could be kind. That night we ate supper by the river, the sound of the water a soft murmur beneath our voices. The pot hung over the fire, steam rising from its rim, and the smell of beans and salt pork drifted through the camp. I thought about what the old woman had said. We all borrow each other's strength. I was beginning to understand what she meant. But this was not our destination. The river ran on without us, and we had to follow our own line west. By morning, the wagons were hitched again, the fires stamped out, the meadow left behind. I looked back once as we rolled away, watching the cottonwood trees grow smaller until they were just a dark line against the sky. As I walked away, I found myself thinking that the world might be kind, if only we kept being kind to each other. I did not know then how much that lesson would matter, but I carried it with me, along with the tin cup, into the days ahead. I later learned this squat cluster of buildings was called Fort Bridger, a sort of halfway house between the known and the unknown. It was not much to look at. A few cabins huddled together behind a rough stockade, their walls weathered by more winters than I could imagine. But after weeks on the open trail, it felt almost like a city. When I first saw it, I thought it looked like a town trying very hard not to blow away. The buildings leaned slightly, as if the wind had been pushing at them for years. Horses and mules stood tied to posts, and men in buckskin moved between the structures with the easy confidence of people who belonged there. We camped just outside the stockade, our wagons drawn into the familiar circle, our fires lit as the sun began to sink. The grown-ups went into the fort to trade and gather news, while we children were left to tend the animals and stay out of trouble. I wandered as close to the stockade gate as I dared, trying to catch glimpses of the world inside. There were traders there, I knew, men who had spent years in these mountains and knew every pass and stream. There were also, I had heard, men who claimed to know a faster way to California, a shortcut that could save weeks of travel. I did not understand then why a shortcut might be anything but good news. Faster seemed better. Shorter seemed smarter. I was 12, and the logic of the trail was still beyond me. But I noticed the way the grown-ups talked about it. Their voices dropped when they mentioned the name, Hastings Cutoff, and their faces took on a careful, considering look, as if they were weighing something heavy in their minds. It was at Fort Bridger that I met the interpreter. He was a man of mixed heritage, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see more than most. He spoke to the traders in one language and to us in another, moving between the two as easily as breathing. I found him sitting on a barrel near the gate, whittling a stick into something that might have been a spoon. "You're with the California party," he said, not looking up from his work. Yes, sir. He nodded slowly, the knife moving in small, precise strokes. These mountains have their own ideas about when a man may pass, he said. You listen to them as much as to your captains. I did not know what to say to that. The mountains were just shapes on the horizon, blue and distant. They did not seem like things that had ideas. But something in his voice made me remember his words later, when the snow began to fall. Before we left Fort Bridger, my father came back to the wagon with a scrap of paper in his hand. It was a rough map, hand-drawn, showing water sources and landmarks along the route ahead. Someone, a trapper perhaps, or one of the traders, had given it to him quietly, away from the main group. Might come in handy, Father said, tucking it into his shirt pocket. Never hurts to have more than one set of directions. I watched him fold it carefully, and I wondered why he looked so serious. A map was a good thing, wasn't it? A way to know where you were going. I did not understand then that maps could also show you how far you still had to go, and how easily you could get lost. The party decided, after much discussion, to take the cutoff. I knew only that our wagon wheels turned when the others did. Where they went, we went. As we rolled away from Fort Bridger, I watched the low roofs sink behind a rise and felt, without knowing why, that we had crossed a line we could never step back over. Looking back now, I see that moment as a kind of door, one that closed behind us even as we thought we were moving forward. But at the time, I only knew that the road ahead was long, and that our little pot still swung faithfully at the wagon's side, marking each mile with its quiet clank. There was a moment, I returned to it often in my dreams, when we camped far from any tree, the wagons drawn into a circle and the whole sky laid open above us. It was one of those nights when the air was so clear you could see forever. The sun had set in a blaze of orange and pink, and as the color faded, the stars began to appear, first one, then a handful, then more than I could count, scattered across the darkness like sparks rising from a fire that never went out. I lay on my back near our wagon, a blanket beneath me and the canvas top arching overhead like the roof of a tiny house. My sister was beside me, her red scarf folded under her head as a pillow. Annie was already asleep, her small body curled against Mother's side. Father sat by the fire, talking quietly with some of the other men. Their voices reached me as a low murmur, words I could not make out but tones I understood, serious, thoughtful, the sound of grown-ups trying to solve problems that had no easy answers. But up there, above the worries and the dust and the endless miles, the sky was infinite. I remember staring at the Milky Way, that great river of light that curved across the heavens. I had seen it before, of course, back in Illinois, but never like this. Out here, away from any town or farmhouse, there was nothing to dim its glow. It seemed close enough to touch, as if I could reach up and trail my fingers through it like water. "Do you think anyone lives up there?" my sister whispered. I thought about it for a moment. "I don't know, maybe. Maybe they're looking down at us right now," she said, "wondering who we are." The idea made me smile. We were so small, our little circle of wagons just a speck on the vast prairie. But we were also here alive together. That had to count for something. From somewhere in the camp, I heard a woman singing. Her voice was soft, almost swallowed by the night, but the melody carried. A lullaby, I think, though I did not recognize the words. It blended with the crackle of the fire and the distant call of coyotes, all of it weaving together into a kind of music that belonged only to this place, this moment. I felt something shift inside me then. The tightness that had been in my chest since we left home began to ease, just a little. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but lying there under those stars, I felt as if we were part of something larger than ourselves. We were a little cluster of lights moving through a great darkness, and as long as we stayed together, we were not lost. "I think we're going to be all right," I said quietly, though I was not sure if I was speaking to my sister or to myself. She did not answer. When I turned my head, I saw that her eyes were closed, her breathing slow and even. She had drifted off without even knowing it. I let my own eyes close, the stars still burning in my mind. The singing had stopped, replaced by the soft sounds of the camp settling into sleep. The fire popped once, twice. An ox shuffled its feet. And somewhere out there, beyond the edge of the firelight, the road went on, waiting for us to follow it in the morning. Something inside me softened that night. I began to think of the road not as something to be endured, but as a story we were writing, mile by mile, star by star. I did not know then how hard some of those miles would become, but I am grateful, even now, for that moment of peace under the prairie sky. The days after Fort Bridger were different. The land itself seemed to shift, as if we had crossed some invisible boundary and entered a new country. The grass grew thinner, the ground grew harder, and always in the distance the mountains rose, blue and gray and impossibly high, their peaks touched with white even in the summer heat. We were following the shortcut now, the route that the grown-ups had debated and finally chosen. I did not understand all the reasons behind the decision, but I understood enough to know that some people were worried. The trail was rougher than expected. The water sources were farther apart, and the mountains ahead were not getting any smaller. Our little pot still hung from the wagon's side, but the meals it produced were changing too. We had less of everything now, less flour, less salt, less of the dried meat that had seemed so plentiful when we started. Mother stretched each meal as far as it would go, adding water to the stew, baking biscuits smaller than before. I did not complain. None of us did. We were all learning in our own ways that the journey was longer than we had imagined, and that the only way through was together. At night, I would take out my tin cup and hold it in my hands, feeling its familiar weight. The old woman at the river camp had told me to pass it on someday, when I met someone who needed kindness. I wondered when that day would come and what it would look like. But for now, the cup was mine, a small comfort in the vast and empty land. What happened next is something I have thought about many times since. The crossing of the salt desert, a place that seemed, to my young eyes, like the surface of another world. I later heard grown men say the words Hastings Cutoff with a bitterness I did not understand then. To me, it was first just a white, empty place they called the Salt Desert. When I first saw it, I thought we had come to the edge of the world. There was no grass, no trees, no shade. Just an endless expanse of white that stretched from one horizon to the other, shimmering in the heat like something out of a fever dream. The ground cracked underfoot, dry and brittle, and the light was so bright it hurt to look anywhere but down. We crossed it at night, or tried to. The grown-ups said it was cooler then, easier on the animals. But even in the darkness, the salt seemed to glow, reflecting the starlight back at us until the whole world felt like a single, pale blur. I walked beside the wagon, my feet crunching on the white crust. My mouth was dry, everyone's was, and the water barrels were running low. Mother had given each of us a small ration that morning, and I had made mine last as long as I could, taking tiny sips and holding each one in my mouth before swallowing. But by the second night, even that was not enough. I remember stumbling. I do not remember falling, but I must have, because suddenly I was on my knees, the salt rough against my palms, the world tilting strangely around me. A hand caught my elbow and pulled me upright. It was a woman from another wagon. I did not know her name, had barely spoken to her the whole journey, but her face was kind and her voice was steady. "Easy, child," she said. "Just a few more miles. Can you do a few more miles?" I nodded, though I was not sure if it was true. She reached for her canteen. I could see it was nearly empty, and tilted it to my lips. "Just a sip," she said, "enough to remember hope by." The water was warm and tasted faintly of leather, but it was the sweetest thing I had ever drunk. I felt it slide down my throat, and something inside me unclenched, just enough to keep moving. "Thank you," I whispered. She smiled and patted my shoulder. "We look after each other. That's how we make it through." We did make it through, eventually. The salt desert ended, giving way to scrubby hills, and then, at last, to a trickle of water that became a stream. The animals drank deeply, and so did we, our faces pressed to the surface, our hands cupped and dripping. I learned something in that desert, though I did not have words for it at the time. I learned that water, like food, was more than just something you needed to survive. It was something you shared. It bound you to the people around you, turning strangers into neighbors and neighbors into something closer. A kind of family made not by blood, but by the simple act of keeping each other alive. As I walked away from that white, shimmering place, I understood that the land could be both beautiful and indifferent, and that our little cooking pot was more precious than ever, because it meant we could turn whatever we had into something to share. I still think about that woman sometimes, the one who gave me water when she had so little herself. I never learned her name, but her kindness stayed with me, a small light in a very dark stretch of road. I later learned they called it Truckee Meadows, a sweet hollow of grass and water before the ground rose into the Sierra Nevada. To me, after the salt desert, it looked like a promise kept. When I first saw it, I thought it was the most beautiful place in the world. Tall grass bent in the breeze, green and gold and silver. Clear streams cut through the valley floor, their water cold and clean. And trees, real trees, stood along the banks, their leaves rustling in the wind like whispered welcomes. We made camp there for a few days, letting the animals rest and regain their strength. The grown-ups talked about the mountains ahead, their voices low and serious, but for a little while at least, the urgency seemed to lift. We had made it this far. We would make it the rest of the way. I spent those days exploring the edges of the camp, wading in the streams and climbing the low hills to look out at the peaks rising in the distance. They were closer now than they had ever been, so close I could see the snow on their tops, gleaming white against the blue sky. In these mountains, boy, a guide told me one afternoon, the snow can come like a door slamming. Best be through the frame before then. He was an older man, lean and weathered, with hands that never seemed to stop moving. He was sharpening a knife when he spoke, the blade flashing in the sunlight, and his eyes were fixed on the peaks as if he could see something there that I could not. "How long do we have?" I asked. He shrugged. "Hard to say, weeks maybe, or days. The mountains keep their own calendar." I did not fully understand what he meant, but his words stayed with me, settling into the back of my mind like a stone dropped into still water. Before we left that valley, another kindness found us. There was an older man who had set up a small repair fire near the edge of the camp, mending wagon parts for anyone who needed it. My father brought him our cooking pot, whose bale had come loose during the rough crossing of the desert. The man examined it carefully, turning it in his hands, testing the weight and the balance. Then he set to work, his fingers quick and sure, tightening the bale and smoothing a rough spot on the rim. "There," he said when he was finished, holding the pot up to the light. "She'll hold a few more winters yet." "Thank you," my father said, reaching for his purse. The man waved him off. No charge for something that's seen this many miles. You just take care of it and it'll take care of you. I watched my father tuck the pot back into its place on the wagon, and I felt a small swell of pride. We had carried that pot all the way from Illinois, through dust and heat and thirst, and it was still with us. It would be with us still when we reached California. So that was what I believed then, anyway. As we rolled out of Truckee Meadows and began the long climb into the mountains, I looked back once at the green valley spread out below us. The streams glittered in the afternoon sun. The grass rippled like water. I did not know it then, but that was the last easy ground we would see for a very long time. As I walked away from that green valley, I felt as if we were walking up a long, invisible stairway toward something vast and waiting, something I could not see but could almost feel, pressing down from the peaks above. The mountains were beautiful. Even now, I can close my eyes and see them, blue and gray and white, rising against the sky like the walls of some great cathedral. But mountains do not care about the people who climb them. They do not care about wagons or children or little iron pots. They simply are, and you either pass through them or you do not. We thought we would pass through. We thought we still had time. So we were wrong. The road climbed. The air grew thinner and colder. And one morning, as we made our way through a stand of tall firs, something soft and white began to drift down from the sky. Snow. At first, we children laughed and reached out our hands to catch the flakes. They melted on our palms, cold and ticklish, and we stuck out our tongues to taste them. But the grown-ups did not laugh. They looked up at the sky and then at each other, and their faces were very still. I did not yet know that this soft, pretty fall was only the first page of a very long winter. What happened next, the cabins, the waiting, the long frozen months, is something I have carried with me all my life. If you are still awake, I will tell you about it now. And if your eyes are growing heavy, know that the story will wait for you, gentle and patient, like snow settling on a quiet forest. Rest if you need to. I am not going anywhere. There was a moment. I still see it when I close my eyes, when the first snowflakes drifted down among the tall firs, and everything in the world seemed to pause. We had been climbing for days by then, the wagons groaning over rocky ground, the oxen straining against their yokes. The air had grown thin and cold, each breath a little sharper than the last, and the trees had changed too, no longer the scattered pines of the lower slopes, but tall, dark firs that stood in silent rows, their branches reaching up toward a sky that had turned the color of old pewter. I was walking beside the wagon when it started. At first I thought it was ash from someone's fire, drifting on the wind. But then a flake landed on my sleeve, and I saw its perfect, crystalline shape before it melted into the wool. Snow. I had seen snow before, of course. In Illinois, winters were long and white, and I knew the feel of cold powder crunching underfoot. But this was different. This snow fell gently, almost hesitantly, as if it were not quite sure whether it wanted to stay. Annie was the first to laugh. She ran out from under the wagon cover, her arms spread wide, her face turned up to the sky. The flakes landed on her cheeks, on her eyelashes, on the tip of her nose, and she spun in circles, trying to catch them on her tongue. "It's snowing," she cried as if we could not see it ourselves. "It's really snowing." My sister smiled and adjusted her red scarf, pulling it tighter around her neck. "Just a little," she said. "It'll probably stop soon." I wanted to believe her. I think we all did. The snow was so light, so pretty, like something from a picture book. Surely it was just a passing flurry, a brief reminder that we were high in the mountains now, close to the sky. But I noticed that the grown-ups did not share our delight. Father stood at the front of the wagon, his hand shading his eyes as he looked up at the peaks ahead. Mother had gone very still, her fingers wrapped around the edge of the wagon cover, her face pale. "We need to move faster," someone said from the wagon behind ours. "We need to get through the pass before this gets worse." I did not understand then what worse might mean. I only knew that the snow kept falling, soft and silent, covering the ground in a thin white blanket that grew thicker with each passing hour. By nightfall, it was up to my ankles. By morning, it was past my knees. And still it fell. I remember lying in the wagon that night, listening to the soft hiss of flakes landing on the canvas above my head. It was a gentle sound, almost soothing, like the whisper of rain on a roof. Annie was asleep beside me, her breath warm against my neck. My sister had wrapped her scarf around both of us, the red wool bright even in the dim light. Outside, the world was being erased. The trees, the rocks, the trail we had followed for so many miles, all of it was disappearing under the white. I did not yet know that this soft, pretty fall was only the first page of a very long winter. I did not know that the pass ahead would soon be blocked, that our wagons would go no farther, that everything we had planned and hoped for was about to change. But somewhere deep inside, I think I sensed it. I think I felt the weight of what was coming, settling over us like the snow itself, quiet, relentless, and very, very cold. Even now, I dream of that moment sometimes, the flakes drifting down, Annie spinning with her arms outstretched, the world going white around us. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was the beginning of the hardest months of my life. The next days blurred together in a fog of cold and effort and growing fear. We tried to push through the pass. I know we did. The grown-ups drove the oxen forward, shouting encouragement, their voices hoarse against the wind. The animals strained and struggled, their hooves slipping on the icy ground, their breath coming in great white clouds. But the snow was too deep. Every step we gained, we seemed to lose two more. The drifts rose higher and higher until they were over the wagon wheels, over the oxen's backs, over everything. I remember my father's face during those days. It was a face I had never seen before, tight and strained, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been in Illinois. He did not speak much, except to give orders or to check on the animals. But at night, when he thought we children were asleep, I heard him talking quietly with Mother, their voices low and urgent. "We can't go forward," he said once. "The pass is blocked." "Then we go back," Mother replied. "We find another way." But there was no other way. The snow behind us was as deep as the snow ahead. We were caught like flies in amber in the high reaches of the Sierra Nevada. Finally, after days of trying, the decision was made. We would not push on. We would not go back. We would stop here in this clearing by the lake, and we would wait for the snow to melt. I did not understand then how long that wait would be. None of us did. What I remember most about those early days is the silence. Once we stopped moving, once the wagons were still and the oxen were unhitched, the world seemed to grow very quiet. There was only the snow falling and falling, and the wind whispering through the trees, and the sound of our own breathing, slow, steady waiting. I later heard people call it Donner Lake, though in that winter it felt more like the end of the earth than a lake. When I first saw the little clearing by the water, I thought it would be just another camp. We had made so many camps by then, each one a temporary pause before the next day's travel. I did not understand that this one would become our whole world. The lake itself was beautiful in a cold and lonely way. It stretched out between the mountains, its surface dark and still, reflecting the gray sky and the snow-covered peaks that rose on every side. The trees around it were tall firs and pines, their branches heavy with white, their trunks disappearing into drifts that grew deeper every day. We were not the only families there. Others from our party had stopped in the same area, some near the lake, some a few miles away at a place they called Alder Creek. In all, there were perhaps 80 of us, scattered across the frozen landscape, each group huddled in whatever shelter they could find or make. The men began building almost immediately. They felled trees and dragged them through the snow, their breath coming in great white puffs, their hands red and raw despite their gloves. They built rough cabins, not the kind we had known in Illinois, with proper floors and windows, but crude shelters with walls of stacked logs and roofs of pine branches covered with hides. I helped where I could. I carried branches. I packed snow into the gaps between logs to keep out the wind. I did whatever the grown-ups told me to do, trying to be useful, trying to feel like I was doing something other than just waiting. Our family shared a cabin with another family from the train. It was small, perhaps 12 feet by 12, with a fire pit in the center and beds of pine boughs along the walls. The smoke from the fire had nowhere to go except up through a hole in the roof, and it filled the space with a haze that made my eyes water. But it was shelter. It was something. Mother set up our cooking area near the fire, arranging our supplies in neat rows. The pot hung from a makeshift hook, its familiar shape a comfort in this strange new home. "If we're to be stuck here a while," a neighbor woman said, coming in with an armful of firewood, "we'll make it as much like home as we can. Bring your pot. We'll see what we can coax out of it." Her name was Mrs. Breen, and she had a way of making even the smallest space feel warmer. She shared what she had: a little flour, some dried apples, a handful of beans, and Mother did the same. Together, they made a meal that first night that tasted almost like hope. After supper, Mrs. Breen pressed something into my hands. It was a scrap of quilt, worn and faded, but still soft. "Tuck that around your shoulders at night," she said. "It's not much, but it'll help." I thanked her, folding the fabric carefully and tucking it into my blankets. It smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke, and when I wrapped it around myself, I could almost imagine I was back in our farmhouse, safe and warm. But outside, the snow kept falling. Day after day, it fell. The drifts rose past the cabin windows, past the roof line, until we had to dig tunnels just to reach the door. The world shrank down to the space between our four walls and the narrow paths we carved through the white. I learned in those early days how to cope when camp becomes home. I learned that even improvised shelters could hold warmth when filled with shared effort. I learned that the sound of voices, talking, singing, even arguing, was better than silence, because silence meant that someone had given up. But I also learned that hope was a fragile thing, easily buried under snow. As the weeks passed, I began to take short journeys between cabins, trudging through the drifts to check on neighbors, to carry messages, to share whatever small comforts we could find. Each trip was exhausting. The snow sucked at my legs like quicksand, and the cold bit at every inch of exposed skin. But it was also necessary. We were not just surviving, we were holding on to each other. As I pushed open the cabin door one evening and stepped back into the swirling flakes, I felt the world shrinking down, until it was just our few cabins, the trees, the lake, and the sky. And the snow. Always the snow. I think about those early days often. The hope we still carried. The belief that the snow would stop, that spring would come, that we would walk out of those mountains and continue on to California. We did not know then how long we would be there. We did not know what we would lose. But we knew even then that we had each other, and for a while that was enough. The days took on a rhythm, though it was not the rhythm of travel. We woke when the light crept in through the gaps in the cabin walls. Gray light, always gray, filtered through the snow that pressed against us from all sides. We ate what we had, which grew less each day. We talked, or we did not talk. We watched the fire, feeding it carefully, knowing that the wood pile was not infinite. Father and some of the other men went out each day to hunt, but they rarely came back with much. The animals that lived in these mountains had hidden themselves away, buried in their own burrows and dens, waiting out the winter the way we were trying to do. Mother kept our little pot busy, even when there was almost nothing to put in it. She would melt snow for water, add a few scraps of whatever we had left, and let it simmer until it became something that could be called soup, if you were generous with the word. I did not complain. None of us did. We ate what we were given and were grateful for it. But I noticed things. I noticed that Father's belt was tighter than it had been. I noticed that Mother's cheeks had grown hollow. I noticed that Annie's energy, which had once seemed inexhaustible, was fading day by day. I noticed, too, that the grown-ups were beginning to whisper. They gathered in corners, their heads closed together, their voices low. When we children came near, they fell silent and smiled in ways that did not reach their eyes. I did not know what they were discussing. I did not want to know, but I understood in a way that went beyond words that the situation was worse than they were telling us. What I learned in those weeks was patience. Not the easy patience of waiting for something you know is coming, but the harder kind. The patience of waiting without knowing what you are waiting for. I learned to take each day as it came, to find small pleasures where I could, to hold on to hope even when hope seemed foolish. And I learned that waiting, true waiting, is its own kind of journey. We had no fancy name for that place by then. It was just the cabin, as if no other cabin in the world mattered. When I woke some mornings, the inside of the roof was white with frost, and even our breath seemed to freeze in the air before it faded. The fire we kept burning day and night was never quite enough to push back the cold, and we spent most of our time huddled close to it, wrapped in every blanket and scrap of cloth we owned. The snow outside was taller than I was. When I went out, which was less and less often as the weeks wore on, I had to climb up through the tunnel we had dug, emerging into a world that was all white and gray and silent. The trees were just dark shapes in the distance, half buried. The lake was invisible under its blanket of snow and ice. The sky seemed to press down on us, heavy and low. Inside the cabin, the world was small but still alive. We talked to pass the time. We told stories. We sang songs that we half remembered from home, the melodies carrying us back to warmer days. There was a boy in our cabin, a few years older than me, whose name I will not share. He had a gift that I had not expected, a small knife, and a piece of soft pine that he would whittle whenever his hands were not needed for other tasks. I watched him work, fascinated by the way the wood curled away from the blade, revealing shapes beneath. He made small animals mostly, horses, dogs, rabbits, and he gave them to the younger children to play with. "When you can't walk far," he told me one afternoon, "you make journeys in your head. Here, this little horse can take you anywhere you like." He pressed the carving into my hand. It was rough but recognizable, a horse with its mane flowing back as if caught in the wind. I turned it over in my fingers, feeling the texture of the wood, the tiny grooves left by his knife. "Thank you," I said. He shrugged. "Keep him. He's got stronger legs than any of us right now." I did keep him. That little wooden horse stayed in my pocket through all the days and weeks that followed, a reminder that even in the darkest times, someone had thought to make something beautiful. But the beauty was growing harder to find. The pot that had been the center of our world now held less and less. Meals that had once been thin soups became thinner still, just water with a few scraps floating in it, more memory than food. The dried meat was gone. The flour was gone. The beans were gone. There came a day when our little pot held more hope than substance, and the grown-ups began to speak in whispers outside the door. I knew enough not to listen. I knew enough not to ask. But I saw the way they looked at each other, the way their faces changed when they thought we were not watching. Something was happening. Something was being decided, and whatever it was not for children to know. I lay down that night with the wooden horse clutched in my fingers. I thought about Illinois, about our farmhouse, about the fields that would be green now if spring had come. I thought about California, about sunshine and oranges, about all the things we had been promised. And I understood for the first time that the hardest part of hunger was not in the stomach. It was in the heart. I have carried that understanding with me all my life. The body can endure more than we imagine. It is the spirit that needs tending. In that cabin, surrounded by snow and silence and uncertainty, we tended each other's spirits the best we could. We told stories. We sang. We held on to each other. And we waited. I later heard people call them the snowshoe party, the ones who strapped makeshift boards to their feet and walked into the white to find help. When I saw them ready themselves at the tree line, they looked like figures out of a story, tall against the snow, bundled in every layer they could find, with ropes and blankets and the weight of all our hopes tied tight around them. There were 15 of them, I think, men and women both, the strongest and the bravest among us. They were going to walk out of the mountains. They were going to find the settlements in the valleys below and bring back rescue. At least that was the plan. I stood with my family near the cabin entrance, watching them prepare. The snow had stopped falling for once, and the sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the sun a cold white disk that gave light but no warmth. One of the young men in the group came over to where I stood. He was not much older than my sister, 18, maybe 19, with a thin face and eyes that seemed too old for his years. "You keep that fire going for us all right," he said, looking down at me. "We'll follow the smoke home." I nodded, not trusting my voice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a button, I think, from his coat. He pressed it into my palm. "That's my promise," he said. "I'll be back to get it." I closed my fingers around the button, feeling its cool metal surface. "I'll keep it safe," I managed. He smiled then, a quick, bright smile that reminded me of how people used to smile before the snow came. Then he turned and walked away, joining the others at the edge of the clearing. My father stood nearby, watching them go. I knew he had debated joining them. I had heard the conversations, the arguments, the long silences that followed. In the end, he had decided to stay. "I would go," he had told Mother, his voice rough with something I could not name. "But you need me here more. The children need me." "Sometimes bravery is staying," she had replied, her hand on his arm. I did not understand those words then. I thought bravery was action, walking into the snow, facing the mountains, doing something. Staying behind, waiting, felt like giving up. But I understand now. I understand that it took courage for my father to stay, to watch others go, to trust that they would bring help while he kept his family alive. The snowshoe party set out in the early morning, their figures dark against the white. We watched them climb the first rise, their progress slow and labored, each step a battle against the drifts. They reached the top, turned once to wave, and then disappeared over the other side. They were gone, and we were left behind to wait. The days that followed were the hardest of my life. Each morning I woke hopping to hear voices, to see figures emerging from the trees, to know that help had come. Each night I went to sleep with that hope still unfulfilled. I kept the button in my pocket next to the wooden horse. I touched them both throughout the day, running my fingers over their familiar shapes, reminding myself that someone was out there, fighting through the snow, coming to save us. But the snow kept falling, and the silence kept growing. Father led us through those days with a quiet steadiness that I did not fully appreciate until much later. He rationed what little food we had, making sure the children ate first. He kept the fire burning, even when the wood was running low. He told us stories at night, his voice calm and even, as if we were back in Illinois, gathered around the kitchen hearth. "California is still waiting," he would say. "We're going to get there, all of us, together." I wanted to believe him. I tried to believe him. But as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks stretched on with no sign of rescue, The belief grew harder to hold. I walked back through the hush of the snow after seeing the snowshoe party off, and I counted each step, as if every footfall might pull them one step closer to finding help. Waiting, I learned, is its own kind of journey. You do not move through space, but you move through time, and each hour is a step toward something: rescue or despair, hope or surrender. I chose hope. We all did, even when it hurt, even when it seemed foolish. Because hope was all we had left. There was a night, I dream of it still, when the wind stopped and the whole forest seemed to be holding its breath. It came in the deepest part of winter, when we had been in the cabins for so long that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to walk freely, to feel the sun on my face, to see ground instead of snow. I woke in the darkness, uncertain what had pulled me from sleep. The fire had burned low, just embers glowing orange in the pit, and the cabin was silent except for the soft breathing of my family around me. But something was different. I lay still, listening, and then I realized it was quiet, truly quiet. No wind, no creaking of branches, no hiss of snow against the walls. Just silence. I rose carefully, stepping over the sleeping forms, and made my way to the cabin door. I pushed it open, just a crack, and looked out. The world was transformed. The moon was up, full and bright, and its light poured down over the snow like silver water. The drifts gleamed and sparkled, each crystal catching the glow until the whole clearing seemed to shine with an inner light. The trees stood tall and still, their branches heavy with white, their shadows stretching long and dark across the pristine surface. And above it all, the stars, more stars than I had ever seen, scattered across the black sky in patterns I did not recognize, burning with a cold, distant fire. I stepped outside, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The cold bit at my skin immediately, but I did not care. I stood there in my thin shirt, my feet bare in the snow, and I let the beauty of it wash over me. For a moment, just a moment, I forgot the hunger. I forgot the fear. I forgot the waiting and the uncertainty and the terrible questions that had no answers. There was only this: the moon, the stars, the snow, the silence. And me, small and fragile and alive. I felt standing there that we were part of something larger than ourselves. That our story, as small and desperate as it was written in the same book as the stars and the mountains and the endless snow. That whatever happened, we would not be forgotten. I do not know how long I stood there. Long enough for my feet to grow numb, long enough for the cold to seep through my shirt and settle into my bones. But I could not make myself go back inside. Not yet. Something in me whispered that help was nearer than we knew. That the people who had walked into the snow were still moving, still fighting, still coming for us. That we would not be left here in this beautiful, terrible place forever. I did not know if it was true, but I chose to believe it. And when I finally went back inside, crawling into my blankets beside Annie, I carried that belief with me like a small flame cupped in my hands. Even now, I cannot explain what I felt in that place, but something changed in me that night. I stopped waiting for rescue. I started waiting with rescue, believing, truly believing that it would come. And it did. The days after that night moved differently, or perhaps I moved differently through them. I kept the button and the wooden horse close. I helped Father tend the fire. I told stories to Annie when she grew restless. I made myself useful, made myself present, made myself a part of the small, fragile community that was all we had left. And then one morning the shouts came. I was inside the cabin when I heard them, distant at first, then closer. Voices I did not recognize calling out in the clear, cold air. I scrambled up the tunnel and emerged into the light, blinking against the glare of sun on snow. And there, moving between the trees, I saw them. Dark shapes, human shapes, people in snowshoes and heavy coats, their breath plumbing white, their hands raised in greeting. The rescue party had come. What happened next, the choices, the leaving, the long descent into the valley, is a story for the next part of our night together. But I want you to know this: we survived. Not all of us and not unchanged, but we survived. And that, in the end, is what this story is about. Not the tragedy, not the terrible choices, but the survival, the holding on, the refusal to let go of each other, even when everything else was slipping away. Rest now if you are tired. The hardest part is behind us. The valley is waiting below. And so is the ending of this long, cold night. And then at last I saw it, dark shapes moving between the trees, not wolves or deer, but men. I had dreamed of this moment so many times that at first I was not sure it was real. I stood at the top of the snow tunnel, blinking in the sharp winter light, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. But they were real. They were coming. The rescue party moved slowly through the deep drifts, their snowshoes leaving long tracks behind them. There were 7 of them, I think, bundled in heavy coats and hats, their faces weathered by cold and exertion. They carried packs on their backs and determination in their eyes. I do not remember climbing down from the tunnel. I do not remember running or trying to run, because running was impossible in that snow. I only remember the sound that came out of my mouth, somewhere between a shout and a sob, and then the answering calls from behind me as the others in the cabin heard the commotion and came stumbling out. "They're here," someone was crying. "They've come, they've found us." The first rescuer reached our cabin and stopped, his chest heaving from the effort of the climb. He was a young man, perhaps 25, with a beard that was frosted white and eyes that looked very tired and very kind. He knelt down in the snow so that his face was level with mine. And for a moment, he just looked at me, really looked, taking in my thin face and hollow cheeks and the way my clothes hung loose on my frame. "You're going to be all right now," he said. His voice was rough, as if he had not used it much in a while. "We've come to take you home." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to throw my arms around him and weep with relief. But all I could manage was a nod, my throat too tight for words. They looked at me, and for the first time in months I felt truly seen, not as a burden to be fed, but as a child to be saved. The camp came alive around us. People emerged from cabins, from snow tunnels, from makeshift shelters that had become their entire world. They stumbled toward the rescuers with arms outstretched, with tears streaming down their faces, with sounds that were part laughter and part weeping. My father appeared at my side, his hand on my shoulder, gripping hard. My mother was right behind him, Annie in her arms. My sister stood a few feet away, her red scarf bright against the snow, her face a mix of disbelief and hope. "You came," Father said to the rescuers. "You actually came." "The snowshoe party made it through," one of the men replied. "Barely, but they made it. They told us where you were." The button in my pocket seemed to grow warm. The young man who had given it to me had kept his promise. He had followed the smoke home. Every sense I had was alive in that moment. The smell of leather and wood smoke from the rescuers' clothes, the glare of sun on snow, so bright it made my eyes water, the rough feel of a gloved hand on my shoulder. I was going to live. We were going to live. The nightmare was not over, not yet, but the end was in sight. But the rescue was not as simple as I had imagined. In my dreams, we had all walked out together, the whole camp, leaving the cabins behind and never looking back. The reality was harder. The rescuers had brought food, dried beef, biscuits, a little flour, but not enough for everyone and not enough to make the journey easy. They had come as fast as they could, but the mountains were vast and their supplies were limited. "We can take the strongest first," the lead rescuer explained, gathering the adults together while we children listened from the edges. "The ones who can walk, the children, if they're able, will come back for the others." I saw the way my parents looked at each other, the quick, silent conversation that passed between them in a glance. Father stepped forward. "My children go first," he said, "all three of them, whatever it takes." Mother nodded, her arm tightening around Annie. "We can wait, the children cannot." But my sister shook her head. "I'm not leaving without you," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I can wait for the next group." The argument that followed was quiet but fierce. In the end, it was decided. Annie and I would go with the first rescue party. My sister would stay with our parents and wait for the second group, which the rescuers promised would come within days. It was not what I wanted. I did not want to leave my family, did not want to walk out of those mountains without all of them beside me. But I understood, even then, that this was not about what I wanted. It was about survival. It was about doing whatever was necessary to ensure that we all made it out alive. Mother knelt beside me, her hands on my shoulders, her face close to mine. "You take care of your sister," she said, meaning Annie, who would be coming with me. "You hold her hand, you keep her warm, and when you get to the valley, you wait for us. We'll be right behind you." "I will," I promised. "I'll take care of her." She kissed my forehead, her lips cold against my skin. And then she reached for something beside her, our cooking pot, its iron sides blackened by months of use, its handle worn smooth by countless hands. "Oh, you're taking this," she said. One of the rescuers shook his head. "Ma'am, we need to travel light. Every ounce counts." But Father stepped in, lifting the pot and weighing it in his hands. "This pot has come all the way from Illinois," he said. "It's fed our family through every mile of this journey. It's not just iron, it's our story." The rescuer hesitated, looking from Father to the pot and back again. Then he sighed and nodded. "We'll carry it between us," Father said, pressing the handle into my hands. "You and me, boy, together." I felt the familiar weight of the pot, the curve of the handle against my palm. It was heavy, heavier than I remembered, but it was also home. It was everything we had been and everything we still hope to become. I looked up at my father and I saw something in his eyes I had not seen in months. Hope, real hope. "Together," I said. I reached for the pot's worn handle one more time and I understood. We were not just carrying iron. We were carrying memories. We were carrying love. We were carrying the promise that we would sit around a fire again, a family, whole and together. The journey down from the mountains was unlike anything I had experienced. I had thought the climb up was hard. I had thought the weeks in the cabin were hard. But this long, freezing, exhausting descent through snow that seemed to have no end, this tested me in ways I had not known I could be tested. We traveled in a line, the rescuers leading the way, breaking trail through drifts that were sometimes chest deep. I walked near the middle, Annie's hand clutched in mine, the cooking pot swinging between Father and me on a rope we had fashioned from scraps. The cold bit at my face and hands, finding every gap in my clothing, every inch of exposed skin. My legs burned with the effort of pushing through the snow. My lungs ached from breathing the thin, icy air. But I did not stop. I could not stop. Behind me was the cabin, the waiting, the terrible uncertainty. Ahead of me was the valley and warmth and life. The rescuers shared what food they had. A biscuit pressed into my hand, a strip of dried beef tucked into my pocket for later. One of the men carried Annie on his back when she grew too tired to walk, her small arms wrapped around his neck, her face buried against his coat. I watched them, these strangers who had walked into the mountains to save us, and I felt something I could not quite name. Gratitude, yes, but also wonder. These men did not know us. They owed us nothing, and yet they had come, risking their own lives because they knew we needed help. "Why?" I asked one of them during a brief rest stop. "Why did you come?" He looked at me, his face half hidden by the scarf wrapped around his mouth. "Because you needed us," he said simply. "That's reason enough." I thought about that answer as we continued our descent. I thought about the old woman at the river camp who had given me a tin cup. I thought about the man at Truckee Meadows who had fixed our pot. I thought about Mrs. Breen who had shared her quilt. I thought about the boy who had carved the wooden horse. Kindness, I realized, was not just something you received. It was something you passed on. A chain that stretched from person to person, hand to hand, heart to heart. Someday, I told myself, I would be the one doing the giving. Someday, I would be the one walking into the mountains. The cold bit at my face, but my hands were warm where they gripped the pot, swinging between us like a promise. Each step took us closer to the valley. Each step took us further from the nightmare. And each step I held onto hope. And then at last I saw it. We had been walking for what felt like days, though later I learned it was only 3, when the trees began to thin and the ground began to level. The snow, which had been waist deep in the high passes, was shallower here, and patches of dark earth showed through in places where the sun had reached. I looked up, and there, spread out below us, was a valley. It was not California, not yet, but it was close, so close I could almost taste it. The valley stretched out in a patchwork of brown and green. The snow melted away to reveal grass and brush and the dark lines of streams cutting through the land. Smoke rose from scattered chimneys, farmhouses. I realized real farmhouses with real people inside. The sky above was a pale blue, washed clean by the winter sun. I stopped walking. I could not help it. I just stopped and stared, taking it all in. Annie tugged at my hand. "Is that it?" she whispered. "Is that California?" "Almost," I said. "Almost, Annie, we're almost there." One of the rescuers came up beside us and pointed toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. "Sutter's Fort," he said. "There's food there and beds and people who'll help you. You're going to be all right." I believed him. For the first time in months, I truly believed that we were going to be all right. We made our way down into the valley, our steps lighter now, our hearts lifting with each passing moment. People came out to meet us, strangers, all of them, but their faces were kind and their hands were gentle. They wrapped us in blankets. They led us to fires. They brought us food, real food, warm and abundant, more than we had seen in months. And when we sat down to eat, someone asked if we had a pot of our own. I looked at Father and he looked at me, and together we lifted the iron pot we had carried all the way from Illinois. It was dented now, and the handle was looser than ever, and the bottom was blackened beyond any hope of cleaning. But it was ours. They set it over the fire, and someone dropped in onions and beans and even a little meat, and the smell that rose from it was the sweetest thing I had ever known. It was the scent of being given back my life. There, waiting for me, was more than one person. It was a whole circle of faces, kind and steady, ready to catch us as we stumbled out of that winter. Something inside me at last found rest. We had not brought much out of the mountains, but we had brought each other, and we had brought our pot, the heart of our kitchen, the center of our story. Looking back now, I understand things I could not have understood then. I understand that every step of that journey, every dusty mile on the prairie, every thirsty hour in the salt desert, every frozen night in the cabin, had been leading me here, to this valley, to this old age, to this quiet chair by the fire where I sit now and remember. I understand that the people we lost along the way are not truly gone. They live in our memories, in our stories, in the kindnesses we pass on to others because they first showed kindness to us. The old woman with the tin cup, the boy with the wooden horse, the young man who gave me his button and walked into the snow to save us all. I understand, too, that survival is not just about staying alive. It is about holding onto the things that make life worth living, love and hope, and the simple grace of a shared meal. There were terrible choices made in those mountains. I will not speak of them here, not in detail. This is a story for sleep, not for nightmares. But I will say this. Even in the darkest moments, most of us held onto our humanity. We did what we had to do, but we did not lose ourselves entirely. And that, I think, is what allowed us to rebuild our lives in the years that followed. My family made it out, all of us, eventually. My sister came down with the second rescue party, and my parents with the third. We were thin and weak and changed in ways that would take years to fully understand. But we were together. We settled in California as we had always planned. The land was as golden as the stories had promised, and in time, we found our footing. Father worked the soil again, and Mother kept her garden, and Annie grew up to have children of her own. And the pot, our little iron pot, found its place above a new hearth, in a kitchen that smelled of oranges and sunshine instead of snow and pine. I am 82 years old now. I have lived longer than I ever expected to, longer than many who started that journey with me. I have seen California grow from a wild frontier into something that would have amazed my father, could he have lived to see it. But when the nights grow quiet and the wind moves through the trees outside, I still think of that winter. I think of the snow falling among the firs, and the silence of the cabins, and the way we held on to each other when there was nothing else to hold. I had lost so much, but I had not lost the knowing that we belonged to one another. That is what kept our hands gentle when they might have grown hard. That is what brought us through. How far will someone go to protect their family? How far will they go to hold onto their humanity? I know the answer now. I have lived it. They will go as far as they have to. And somehow, by grace or by luck or by the strength of love, they will find their way home. That was 70 years ago now, dear friend. More than a lifetime since that winter by Donner Lake. The snow is only a memory to me these days. I live in a small house under softer skies, where the winters are kind and the orange trees bloom in their season. My grandchildren play in the yard, their laughter carrying through the open windows, and sometimes I watch them and wonder if they can possibly understand how precious such simple things are. I still have that little cooking pot. The handle is more worn than ever, the bottom blackened beyond any hope of shining. It sits on a shelf above my stove, too old for regular use now, but too precious to put away. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and the wind moves through the trees outside, I reach up and rest my hand on it. Even now, I can feel the chill of that mountain air. And I can feel, too, the warmth of the first true meal it held in the valley below. The onions and beans and meat that tasted like being given back my life. I have carried this story with me for 70 years. Not to dwell on sorrow, though sorrow is part of it. Not to frighten or to warn, though there are lessons in it that I hope others might learn. I have carried it because it is mine, because it made me who I am, and because the people I loved deserve to be remembered. I carry it, too, because of what we found in the midst of it all. Love and courage, and the simple miracle of waking to another morning. The kindness of strangers, the strength of family, the stubborn, beautiful refusal to give up, even when giving up would have been so much easier. If you are still awake, I thank you for listening. If you have drifted off, I hope your dreams are gentle ones, full of warm fires and soft blankets and the faces of people who love you. May you find your own warmth tonight. May you feel, as I did at last, that you are held and that you are not alone. May you carry a little light with you into the darkness, and may that light bring you safely home. Rest now, dear friend. The journey is over. The snow has stopped. The valley is spread out before you, green and golden and waiting. You are safe. Good night.